Hello students, today we are going to discuss Robert Frost's very famous poem Mending Wall. Let us understand who Robert Frost was. Robert Lee Frost was an American poet who lived from 1874 to 1963. He dabbled with both farming and was also an English teacher, but was always convinced that his real calling was to be a poet. Robert Frost is one of the most famous and influential poets in American history. He is highly regarded for his realistic depictions of rural life and his command of American colloquial speech. His simple style of writing and constant attention to nature makes his poems unique. His work frequently employed settings from rural life in New England in the early 20th century, using them to examine complex social and philosophical themes. A popular and oft-quoted poet, Frost was honored frequently and during his lifetime received 4 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry. His poems have captivated thousands and are still a delight to read and study for their profound themes related to social and personal issues. Robert Frost was born on March 26, 1874 in San Francisco, where his father, William Prescott Frost, and his mother, Isabel Moody, had moved from Pennsylvania shortly after marriage. After the death of his father from tuberculosis, when Frost was 11 years old, he moved with his mother and sister Jeannie, who was 2 years younger, to Lawrence, Massachusetts. He became interested in reading and writing poetry during his high school years in Lawrence, enrolled at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire in 1892, and later at Harvard University in Boston, though he never earned a formal college degree. Frost drifted through a string of occupations after leaving high school, working as a teacher, cobbler, and editor of the Lawrence Sentinel. His first published poem, My Butterfly, appeared on November 8, 1894 in the New York newspaper, The Independent. Frost married Eleanor Miriam White, who was his high school classmate. She was also a major inspiration for his poetry until her death in 1938. The couple moved to England in 1912 after they tried and failed at farming in New Hampshire. It was abroad that Frost met and was influenced by such contemporary British poets as Edward Thomas, Rupert Brooke, and Robert Graves. While in England, Frost also established a friendship with the poet Ezra Pound, who helped to promote and publish his work. By the time Frost returned to the United States in 1915, he had published 2 full-length collections, A Boy's Will and North of Boston, and his reputation was established. By the 1920s, he was the most celebrated poet in America, and with each new book, including New Hampshire, A Further Range, Steeple Bush, and In the Clearing, his fame and honors increased. He won 4 Pulitzer Prizes. Frost served as a consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress from 1958 to 1959. Let us discuss the poem Mending Wall. Today we are going to discuss his famous poem Mending Wall. Now let us just read the poem first and understand what it says. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it, and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even 2 can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone. But they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made. But at spring mending time, we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are loaves and some are nearly balls. We have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game. One on a side, it comes to a little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine and I'm apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines. I tell him. He only says good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd asked to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was to like to give a fence. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that won't sit down, and I would say else to him. But it's not else exactly, and I'd rather he said it himself. I see him there, bringing a stone, grasped firmly by the top, in each hand like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. And he says again, good fences make good neighbors. Now, who are good or bad neighbors? They who suffer their neighbors' cattle to go at large because they don't wait their ill will, are afraid to anger them. They are abettors of the ill-doers. David Thoreau once said, who are good neighbors? Whereupon, following his reasoning, one would answer, those who build and maintain walls which keep out their neighbors' cattle. How and indeed whether the goodwill of one's neighbors is fostered by boundaries, however, was a general question that would engage Thoreau's latter-day disciple, Robert Frost. Were walls and fences instrumental in the retention and renewal of human relationship? Is a question central to Mending Wall. The answer the poem presents us with are somewhat less than clear-cut. This is so, at least partly, because Frost has purposely and purposefully left out of his poem a piece of important information. One key to the poet's omission lies in the final lines of the poem. I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top, in each hand like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shades of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors. In these lines, the poet moves back through time beyond his own earlier questioning of the possible reasons for continuing the annual repair of those now apparently useless boundaries to an earlier, darker age. Indeed, his neighbor seems to be moving in a darkness that is suggestively not of woods only and the shade of trees. To the poet, he is now like an old stone savage armed. Even on New England farms in this century, the ways of the savage continue. It would seem no matter how transformed, no matter how radically different. Indeed, Frost shrewdly and characteristically stopped his poem just short of the mythological link towards which the poem is moving. That Frost and his neighbors engage in what is tantamount to a vestigial ritual, and that further prodded by the poet, the neighbor would defend his father's idea that good fences make good neighbors. Relates this poem to the tradition and rituals antedating the Romans. The god of boundaries they named Terminus was not invented by the Romans, but he became one of the important household gods. Annually, Terminus was honored in a ritual which not only reaffirmed boundaries, but which also provided the occasion for predetermined traditional festivities among neighbors. The festival of Terminalia was celebrated in Rome and in the country on the 23rd of February. The neighbors on either side of any boundary gathered around the landmark, the stones which marked boundaries, with their wives and children and servants, and crowned it, each on his own side, with garlands, and offered cakes and bloodless sacrifices. In later times, however, a lamb or a suckling pig was sometimes slain and the stone sprinkled with the blood. Lastly, the whole neighborhood joined in a general feast. If his neighbor does not know that this annual ritual of walking the boundaries to repair the common wall has its obscure source in the all but totally lost mysteries of ancient man, that information could not possibly have been unknown to the serious student of the classics who wrote the poem. What impresses itself upon the poet is that, for whatever reasons men continue to need marked boundaries, even when they find it difficult to justify their existence. In conclusion, it should be noted that Frost's decision, a characteristic and revealing decision, not to link explicitly his view of his farmer's ritualistic occupation to the myth and ritual from which it probably derives, distinguishes his poetic method from that of the modernists who were then predominant. By contrast, a similar mythic parallel in a representative poem by T.S. Eliot or an Ezra Pound, for example, would have been made less subtly either through direct statement or by pointed allusion. Let us discuss the Mending Wall and how Frost made observations about life and relationships. The objective of this poem is the larger question which is more important: the advantage of community or the carefully maintained separation that connect neighbors only each year and only for the process of reinforcing boundaries. The neighbor asserts that a good fence keeps the rest of the world safely at bay with minimal complication. The narrator pokes at the hand-me-down aphorism, "Good fences make good neighbors," but still celebrates the annual ritual of wall building with his taciturn neighbor. Robert Frost holds a unique and almost isolated position in American letters. Though his career fully spans the modern period, and though it is impossible to speak of him as anything other than a modern poet, writes James M. Cox, it is difficult to place him in the main tradition of modern poetry. In a sense, Frost stands at the crossroads of 19th century American poetry and modernism, for in his verse may be found the culmination of many 19th century tendencies and traditions, as well as parallels to the work of his 20th century contemporaries. The important themes in his poetry. Though his work is principally associated with the life and landscape of New England, and though he was a poet of traditional verse forms and metrics, who remained steadfastly aloof from the poetic movements and fashions of his time, Frost is anything but a merely regional poet. The author of searching and often dark meditations on universal themes, he is quintessentially modern poet in his adherence to language as it is actually spoken, in the psychological complexity of his portraits, and in the degree to which his work is infused with layers of ambiguity and irony. In a 1970 review of the poetry of Robert Frost, the poet Daniel Hoffman describes Frost's early work as the puritanic ethic turned astonishingly lyrical and enabled to say out loud the sources of its own delight in the world, and comments on Frost's career as the American bard. He became a national celebrity, a nearly official poet laureate, and a great performer in the tradition of that earlier master of the literary vernacular, Mark Twain. About Frost, President John F. Kennedy, at whose inauguration the poet delivered a poem, said, "He has bequeathed his nation a body of imperishable verse from which Americans will forever gain joy and understanding." Robert Frost lived and taught for many years in Massachusetts and Vermont and died in Boston on January 29, 1963. Frost's place in American literature. Let us discuss Frost's place in American literature. Robert Frost holds a unique and almost isolated position in American letters. Though his career fully spans the modern period, and though it is impossible to speak of him as anything other than a modern poet, it is difficult to place him in the main tradition of a modern poetry. Taking his symbols from the public domain, Frost developed, as many critics note, an original modern idiom and a sense of directness and economy that reflect the imagism of Ezra Pound and Amy Lowell. On the other hand, as Leonard Unger and William Van O'Connor point out in Poems for Study, Frost's poetry, unlike that of such contemporaries as Eliot, Stevens and the later Yeats, shows no marked departure from the poetic practices of the 19th century. Although he avoids traditional verse forms and only uses rhyme erratically, Frost is not an innovator and his technique is never experimental. Let us discuss Frost's theory of poetic composition. Frost's theory of poetic composition ties him to both centuries. Like the 19th century Romantics, he maintained that a poem is never a put-up job. It begins as a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a loneliness. It is never a thought to begin with. It is at its best when it is a tantalizing vagueness. Yet, working out his own version of the impersonal view of art, as Hyatt Edge Wagner observed, Frost also upheld T.S. Eliot's idea that the man who suffers and the artist who creates are totally separate. In 1932, in a letter to Sidney Cox, Frost explained his conception of poetry. The objective idea is all I have ever cared about. Most of my ideas occur in verse. To be too subjective with that, what an artist has managed to make objective is to come on him presumptuously and render ungraceful what he, in pain of his life, had faith he had made graceful. To accomplish such objectivity and grace, Frost took up 19th century tools and made them new. Lawrence Thompson has explained that according to Frost, the self-imposed restrictions of meter in form and coherence in content work to a poet's advantage. They liberate him from the experimentalist burden, the perpetual search for new forms and alternative structures. Thus Frost, as he himself put it in The Constant Symbol, wrote his verse regular. He never completely abandoned conventional metrical forms for free verse, as so many of his contemporaries were doing. At the same time, his adherence to meter, line, length and rhyme scheme was not an arbitrary choice. He maintained that the freshness of a poem belongs absolutely to its not having been thought out and then set to verse, as the verse in turn might be set to music. He believed, rather, that the poem's particular mood dictated or determined the poet's first commitment to meter and length of line. Let us discuss what the critics had to say about Frost's poetry. Critics frequently point out that Frost complicated his problem and enriched his style by setting traditional meters against the natural rhythms of speech. Drawing his language primarily from the vernacular, he avoided artificial poetic diction by employing the accent of a soft-spoken New Englander. In the function of criticism, Winters faulted Frost for his endeavor to make his style approximate as closely as possible the style of conversation. But what Frost achieved in his poetry was much more complex than a mere imitation of New England farmers' idiom. He wanted to restore to literature the sentence sounds that underlie the words, the vocal gesture that enhances meaning. That is, he felt The poet's ear must be sensitive to the voices in order to capture with the written word the significance of sound in the spoken word. The death of the hired man, for instance, consists almost entirely of dialogue between Mary and Warren, her farmer husband. But critics have observed that in this poem, Frost takes the prosaic patterns of their speech and makes them lyrical. To Ezra Pound, the death of a hired man represented Frost at his best, when he dared to write in the natural speech of New England, in a natural spoken speech which is very different from the natural speech of the newspapers and many professors. What does the poet try to convey in the poem Mending Wall? The poem is the first work in Frost's second book of poetry, North of Boston, which was published upon his return from England in 1915. While living in England with his family, Frost was exceptionally homesick for the farm in New Hampshire, where he had lived with his wife from 1900 to 1909. Despite the eventual failure of the farm, Frost associated his time in New Hampshire with the peaceful rural sensibility that he instilled in the majority of his subsequent poems. Mending Wall is autobiographical on an even more specific level. A French Canadian named Napoleon Gay had been Frost's neighbor in New Hampshire, and the two had often walked along the property line and repaired the wall that separated their land. Ironically, the most famous line of the poem, "Good fences make good neighbors," was not invented by Frost himself, but was rather a phrase that Gay frequently declared to Frost during their walks. This particular adage was a popular colonial proverb in the middle of the 17th century, but variations of it also appeared in Norway. There must be a fence between good neighbors. Germany, between neighbors' gardens, a fence is good. Japan, build a fence even between intimate friends. And even India, love your neighbor but do not throw down the dividing wall. In terms of form, Mending Wall is not structured with stanzas. It is a simple 45 lines of first-person narrative. Frost does not maintain iambic stresses, but he is flexible with the form in order to maintain the conversational feel of the poem. He also shies away from any obvious rhyme patterns and instead relies upon the occasional internal rhyme and the use of assonance in certain ending terms, such as wall, hill, walls, well. In the poem itself, Frost creates two distinct characters that have different ideas about what exactly makes a good neighbor. The narrator deplores his neighbor's preoccupation with repairing the wall. He views it as old-fashioned and even archaic. After all, he quips, his apples are not going to invade the property of his neighbor's pine cones. Moreover, within land of such freedom and discovery, the narrator asks, are such borders necessary to maintain relationships between people? Despite the narrator's skeptical view of the wall, the neighbor maintains his seemingly old-fashioned mentality, responding to each of the narrator's disgruntled questions and rationalizations with nothing more than the adage, good fences make good neighbors. As the narrator points out, the very act of mending walls seems to be in opposition to nature. Every year, stones are dislodged and gaps suddenly appear, all without explanation. Every year, the two neighbors fill the gaps and replace the fallen boulders, only to have parts of the wall fall over again in the coming months. It seems as if nature is attempting to destroy the barriers that man has created on the land, even as man continues to repair the barriers simply out of habit and tradition. Ironically, while the narrator seems to begrudge the annual repairing of the wall, Frost subtly points out that the narrator is actually more active than the neighbor. It is the narrator who selects the day for mending and informs his neighbor across the property. Moreover, the narrator himself walks along the wall at other points during the year in order to repair the damage that has been done by local hunters. Despite his skeptical attitude, it seems that the narrator is even more tied to the tradition of wall mending than his neighbor. Perhaps his skeptical questions and quips can be read as an attempt to justify his own behavior to himself. While he chooses to present himself as a modern man, far beyond old-fashioned traditions, the narrator is really no different from his neighbor. He too clings to the concept of property and division of ownership and individuality. Ultimately, the presence of the wall between the properties does ensure quality relationship between the two neighbors. By maintaining the division between the properties, the narrator and his neighbor are able to maintain their individuality and personal identity as farmers, one of apple trees and one of pine trees. Moreover, the annual act of mending the wall also provides an opportunity for the two men to interact and communicate with each other, an event that might not otherwise occur in an isolated rural environment. The act of meeting to repair the wall allows the two men to develop their relationship and the overall community far more than if each maintained their isolation on separate properties. From the opening lines of this poem, Frost establishes that walls must be actively maintained or else they will erode away. People willingly devote their labor to this, but why? The reader is presented with several possible answers, but they seem inadequate. The fact that people persist in building walls suggests that it is our nature, and because it is in our nature, we can expect to see this happening both between individuals and between large groups. In a sense, Frost forces the reader to arrive at this conclusion by process of elimination. Here he suggests is a case where the material and economic reason don't justify a wall, but men continue to maintain it anyway. The narrator has an apple orchard. His neighbor's land is all pines. There can be no mistaking where one property ends and the other begins. It is demarcated by these natural features, and as the narrator notes, there is no threat of encroachment. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. Maintaining a wall would make sense if one of them kept cows. There would be a need for a physical barrier to keep them from roaming away. They don't have cows, though, so there seems to be no economic reason for a wall. Moreover, the neighbors themselves are on friendly terms, so there seems to be no reason to fear trespassing. Maintaining the wall involves a good deal of hassle and labor. It is damaged by hunters, natural forces, elves, and whatever else there is that doesn't love a wall. Yet both men, the narrator included, invest time and labor into fixing the wall. The narrator's comments indicate that he recognizes the futility or silliness in the task, but he doesn't refuse to repair the wall. The poem suggests that the neighbors meet to fix the wall every spring, and it appears this year will be no exception. Something else must impel the men to maintain the wall. The narrator's reference to his neighbors appearing as an old stone savage armed suggests something primal in the act, something intrinsic to human nature. The neighbor's reasoning is that good fences make good neighbors. The narrator is critical of this comment, noting that his neighbor is simply repeating, without reflection, something he heard his father say. It's the only explicit answer to this question that hasn't been refuted during the course of the poem, and it is repeated in the last line. The reader is left to ponder why good fences make good neighbors, since it is not because they require a physical boundary to keep track of the property line, and not because they fear trespassing or the loss of wealth. It would appear the answer concerns human psychology. Even if there are people who question the need for walls, they too will conform in order to maintain good relationships to their wall-loving neighbors. In the poem Mending Wall, the speaker thinks that the long stone wall between his property and that of his neighbor gets destroyed regularly by two things. When it is springtime, the ground thaws out from being frozen, it swells upward. The swelling of the ground ruptures the wall and leaves very large gaps in it. The second thing that destroys the wall is when hunters come by and have a reckless disregard for others' property, they end up smashing bits of the wall as they are trying to drive out animals from their hiding places. However, the narrator admits that he is just guessing about how the wall does get damaged. He mentions that the gaps just show up every spring and no one is actually there to witness the creation of those gaps. The question of how the wall gets damaged on a regular yearly basis is important to our understanding of the poem. Knowing that this happens every spring in a predictable way, we understand that the speaker and his neighbor are doing their mending together as a well-established habit. It makes sense then for the speaker of the poem to spend some time thinking about why they keep mending this wall and why they even need the wall in the first place, when the boundary between the two men's properties is already so obvious. Therefore, we have to understand the poem from a context that is purely psychological and does not have anything to do with the actual wall. I hope you read the poem and understand it, students. Till we